It is my honor to introduce Sandra Morgan.
Good evening, everyone, and I hope you don't mind that I've taken off my mask, but I think I'm far enough away from everyone that we should be okay. I'd like to, first of all, thank everyone for being here today. It's my delight and thrill to be here at the Thomas Hunt Morgan House to deliver some comments to you about my grandfather, Garrett A. Morgan. First I'd like to acknowledge, however, my family and friends. My husband, Joe, my daughter, Eliza, named after her great-great-grandmother, Eliza Reed, from here in Kentucky. Our good friends, Karen and Michael. I'd also like to acknowledge everyone that's on Zoom, including our friends and family who I know are listening in and cheering us on. And I'd also like to thank Dr. John Hackworth, Jackson Osborne, and Brittany Sams, who, although she's no longer here at the Trust, has been an excellent contact and a real guiding hand for me. Thank you all. Again, I'm really thrilled to be here to talk about my grandfather. This is a story that I know oh so well, and he is, after all, a native son of Kentucky, having been raised really right next door in Claysville, which is just outside of Paris. And I'll admit that Kentucky is usually a very small part of my storytelling. I usually make kind of perfunctory statements about him being born in Kentucky, leaving when he was about 15 years old or so, and then really the true action begins when he crosses the Ohio River and goes to Kentucky and then upward towards Cleveland. But you know what? The story is really a lot broader than that. And today I'm going to add some new dimensions to that story, dimensions that, we've known in our family for generations, but that we've never really talked about. We've chosen to simply focus on my grandfather. By now you may be aware that Garrett Morgan's father, Sidney, has generally been acknowledged as the son of John Hunt Morgan and one of the enslaved women of the household. If we're honest with ourselves, we know that shouldn't be news to anyone. Complex relationships between owners and the enslaved were common, and were common knowledge as well. The one-drop rule existed for a reason. The French term mulatto, out of favor now, was coined to describe mixed-race individuals who are quite numerous in this country throughout our history and today. In his glowing memoir about John Morgan, his brother-in-law, Basil Duke, wrote, and I quote, "General Morgan was certainly no saint. His friends may claim that he had no right to that title and not the slightest pretension to it. Like the great majority of men of his class, the gentlemen of the South, he lived freely." There you go. And the amusements he permitted himself would doubtless have shocked a New Englander almost as much as the money he spent in obtaining them. To sum up, General Morgan, with the virtues, had some of the faults of his southern blood and country, and he sought so little to extenuate the latter himself that it may be presumed that he cared not the least whether or not they were recorded. Indeed. So what happened? Well, I cannot say definitively. I wasn't there. But, we do know that, the records for the enslaved and the marginalized were really very slim, right? It was oftentimes really just down to dollars and cents in a ledger book. That being said, here's what we do know. Sidney Morgan was born approximately in 1849. He was born to a woman who was enslaved and a servant in the household. I'm certain it caused a stir for a number of reasons. Why? Well, first of all, within any household, we know that typically the servants know everything, and despite the best efforts of the masters to keep their business to themselves, it still leaked out. It would have been quite a lot of grist for the rumor mill. Second, although John Hunt Morgan had a reputation as a kind man with a very gentle heart, He was also known as a bit of a scamp. And he had been expelled from college for rakish behavior, which he totally owned, by the way. You know, he didn't back away from that. He owned it. And lastly, let's place things into context. In 1849, Morgan was about to get married or was already a newlywed. With inherited funds from his grandfather, he invested in business ventures and purchased a number of slaves. Things were looking rosy for him. It would have been inconvenient at that time to have an entanglement with one of the servants while establishing a new household. Okay, so why didn't anyone say anything earlier? Well, first of all, not exactly a conversation for polite company, and it wouldn't have been necessarily believed anyway. Number two, it would have been dangerous for Sidney to brag about his lineage anywhere in Kentucky or anywhere else for that matter. Moreover, like I said, he would not have been believed. Relatives visiting Hopemont many years ago were treated dismissively in our own family when they offered that bit of information. The person that they spoke to couldn't possibly believe that there could have been any kind of entanglement or involvement between the races at that time. They just simply did not believe it and would not believe it. So there was no reason for Sidney to think that he would be believed. So there you go. Still, Sidney endured both privilege and heartache. He was quick-witted and handsome, mechanically inclined. In another time, he could have been someone great, and yet he was still, at the end of the day, a slave, even though his lineage was unspoken and in some ways acknowledged. He worked for the railroad all of his life, but he encouraged his children, mainly his sons, Nelson, Bismarck, Garrett, and Carl, to work with their heads and not with their hands. A mantra that we, all of us, have heard our entire lives. And this is where my story usually begins. So Garrett was born in 1877, and he was one of 9 children. There are stories that say that there were 11 children, but I've yet to find the other 2 in any records, and so I'm going to stick with 9. As I said, his father worked for the railroad, and his mother was a housekeeper. And Garrett attended the branch school for colored children in Claysville. He saw his father working hard at the railroad, and, as his father said, work with your head and not with your hands. And so I like to describe my grandfather in really 3 distinct sections of his life. Garrett the adventurer, Garrett the entrepreneur and inventor, and Garrett the civil servant. Eliza? All right, and actually I guess I've spoken through our old Kentucky home, so you can go to the next slide. So, and to the next one from that even. Garrett came to Ohio approximately 1892. He was about 15 or 16-year-old when he came, and again, he was ready to work. He knew that Jim Crow was, a fact of life here in Kentucky, and he was not particularly excited by that notion. He was also a high-spirited young man and thought that he could find his way elsewhere. So he moved to Cincinnati because he had family in Ohio, in Cincinnati, in Middletown, in Oberlin, and in other parts of Ohio. No one in Cleveland, but, that was okay. So he moved to Cincinnati. He worked there for a couple of years. He really didn't like it. He didn't think that there was much opportunity for him there either. And so, literally, with a dime in his pocket and, desire in his heart, he hopped a train, jumped on the train, and found himself in Cleveland. While he was on that train, he met one of his lifelong friends, a man who also would become a pillar of Cleveland society and still one of the largest funeral homes in Northeast Ohio, the Boyd family. He met Bill Boyd on the train. The 2 of them were excited to come to Cleveland. They got to Cleveland, and my grandfather says that for 3 days, he didn't know the city at all. He didn't have any friends there. There was a relatively small but growing African American community there. At the time, about 3,000 African Americans in Cleveland. Remember, this was before the Great Migration North. So, but Cleveland was Mecca for him. It was exciting. Business was booming in Cleveland. The Rockefellers were there. You name it. Everything that could be happening anywhere was happening in Cleveland. Rail industry, manufacturing, you name it, innovation, there was just everything. Edison, you name it. And so he thought, this is the place for me. This is where I can go and I can make a name for myself, or not, but at least I can try. So when he got to Cleveland, he spent his first 3 nights sleeping in the same rail car that he arrived in, using newspapers as covers. But eventually someone told him and Bill Boyd where to go in order to get a room and to get a hot meal and that sort of thing. And so they did, got themselves cleaned up, and he got a job right away at a place called Root McBride. Root McBride was a textile factory. At the time in Northeast Ohio, Cleveland in particular, we were one of the largest textile industries centers in the United States. I think third only to New York and Chicago. And so there was a lot to do. And he was the guy who swept up the dust bunnies, essentially, right? But one thing that he noticed was that the women who worked there, the women and the men, did piecework. So for every piece, they got paid by the piece. And in turn, the company was paid for every finished piece. And when a sewing machine went down or was broken, and it was usually that leather belt on the sewing machine, it meant, number one, the woman, usually an Eastern European immigrant, would not get paid for that piece and may be sent home without pay for the day. And number two, the factory was losing money as well. Well, he put his thinking cap on and said, this is inefficient and bad for everybody. So let me think. He put his thinking cap on and he came up with an idea. So in 1895, his idea was that he would, instead of using the leather bands for the sewing machines, that he would use a rubber band. I know it sounds silly, but he used a rubber band. It was one continuous band, right? Moreover, he configured it so that it wasn't just in one big loop, but it was actually a figure 8. And so the tension on the band was even now, and it didn't snap, and it increased productivity, and everybody got paid, and everybody was happy, including the people at Root McBride. They were very happy about it. In fact, they said, oh, you know what? Here's what we're going to do for you, Garrett. We are going to give you $150, we're going to give you a $150 bonus, which in 1895 was a lot of money. And you know what? We'll take care of the patent for you. Don't worry about that. I'm sure they did, but it is what it is. And he also got a promotion. So no longer was he sweeping up dust bunnies, but now he was actually, considered a mechanic on the sewing machines and within the factory, right? He was delighted and thrilled, and that gave him a lot of confidence. That told him, you know what? I can work with my head and not always with my hands, number one. And number two, my ideas are worth something. I can monetize these ideas. And so he continued to work there. He met a beautiful young woman who was a Bohemian seamstress. Her family had moved from the Czechoslovakia at the time, to the United States, and then moved to Cleveland. We had a very large a large Eastern European population in general. Anyway, he met her there. They corresponded. I'm sure that they were moony-eyed towards each other, and people noticed. Said, "Hey, you got to cut this out, okay? We're not having any of this stuff going on here. Either you stop talking to this woman. Her name was Miriam Hashik. Leave her alone. Stop talking to her, or you have to leave this job. We're going to fire you." Well, you know what? The two of them did something very brave indeed. And he said, "I quit," and she said, "I do too." And that was that. And they got married in 1908 and had 3 lovely children, my dad being one of them. So when Garrett left Root McBride, he had to do something, right? And now it's a scramble because he's got a new wife and he's got to figure out something to do. This is Garrett Morgan, the entrepreneur. He's no longer being an adventurer. He's got to settle down and figure something out. So he says, okay, I am going to open up a clothing store. So my grandmother, I called her grandma, but Mary Hoshik Morgan now, was an expert seamstress. They opened a children's clothing store. She did, in her spare time, she sewed for the Richmond brothers, doing piecework for them periodically. They opened a poultry store where they sold live poultry and eggs and that sort of thing. In short, he was hustling to make a living, right? During that time, he noticed that there was an explosion in the hair care industry, actually in beauty in general, right? African American men and women were becoming a little more prosperous. They were more interested in their personal appearance. Madam C.J. Walker and many others were really, having a high profile, and he saw this and said, you know what? This is the business for me. I think I can do this too. And so he went into his workshop, and I'm going to point out again, he went to the Branch School for Colored Children in Claysville. When he left at the age of 14 or so, he had a 6th grade education. There was no chemistry, there was no biology, there was no science. He learned to, as he said, read, write, and figure. That's what he learned in school. All right, so undaunted, he came up with formulas, for a variety of hair care products, including, it was the Garrett Morgan Hair Refinery. His most famous product was the Garrett Morgan Black Hair Oil Stain, which, would turn your hair a silky black from the whitest of white, including your beard or mustache. And it was made from pure ingredients, pure oils and dyes. And to illustrate his point, he would, when he would go to various pharmacies and barbershops and the like, he would shake up a bottle after his presentation and glug it down. Okay, to say, you see, it's 100% what we would say now, organic, and it can't harm you. Here I am, okay? And he had a full lineup of products: hair pomades, lip pomades, pomades for making your lips fuller, pomades for making your lips thinner, all sorts of stuff. Okay. He also had, and you can see his price list here. He traveled all over the East Coast selling these products, and believe it or not, these products remained on the market until approximately 1974 or 75. My father continued to make these products well after my grandfather had passed away. Next slide, Eliza. All right, so, this may seem a little snarky. However, these are the kinds of ads that they would routinely use for, kind of your before and after pictures. Little girl's hair's looking a little unruly on one side. Next picture, look at how beautiful she looks. And she's pensive and thoughtful and smart too, all because of her hairstyle. Next slide, please. So ultimately, he created a hair comb, a hot comb, essentially, the Garrett Morgan uncurling comb, which he patented. And this comb, there were many other combs, but it was an improvement on what we call the hot comb. Why? Because the triangular head on top created a method that you could get as close as possible to the roots of your hair without actually touching and burning your scalp. Very long description of it, but the long and short of it is that he patented this particular hot comb, and these hot combs sold like hotcakes. Thank you, Eliza. So, the really nice thing about the hair care products was that it provided him now with a comfortable living. He was able to close the poultry market and consolidate some of his other things in order to really focus and think. By now, he knows that his ideas are he's got good ideas, that he can monetize his ideas, and he became a leader in the community as a result of it too. One of the things that he did note was that there were fires all the time. I mean, Cleveland was an industrial town. I think a couple of people have noted here that, our river caught on fire not once, not twice, but 6 times. All right, so there was a lot of industrial waste distribution. There was just a lot going on. And safety rules were not what they are now. And when a fire broke out, it was very difficult to get people out. Typically, and especially in textiles, with cotton or other fibers, once they caught fire, it was almost certain that people would die. They would not be able to get out of the building. And so he thought there's got to be a way to help people to, number one, get in and help bring people out, but number two, to actually get out of these buildings. And so, the rumor is that he was at the circus with my Uncle John and, was watching the elephants, and it was a sweltering day, and he was in a tent, and he saw the elephant stick his nose, out of the tent and grab some air and then continue with his performance. And he thought, eureka, that looks like a good idea, that, his trunk. So, my grandfather in about 1910-11 started tinkering with the idea of a safety helmet or a safety hood. Now again, there were all kinds of safety helmets, some of them that looked like, voyage to the bottom of the seat. There were all sorts of things in the marketplace, but they were not necessarily effective or efficient. My grandfather, if nothing else, was a great public servant, right? Public safety was his thing. So he created this safety hood and patented it. He submitted the patent in 1911 or 12, and he received the patent in 1914. And, if you'd go to the next slide, I think we can demonstrate why it was so effective. If you see in the front, there's the eye openings and where the mouth is, and those were made of mica. They were not made of glass or anything like that, which many other people had, which if you go into a burning building, what's going to happen? The glass is going to explode, and then that's it. So that was number one. But more importantly, if you see the 2 chambers that come down, and if you go to the next slide, Eliza, the 2 chambers that come down under his arms and then around to the back, there was actually a filter pack that was down by the ground. And that filter pack, there was a carbon filter pack, which would, number one, help to filter the air, and number two, we know that the hot air rises and the cool, clean air stays down near the ground, right? And so your air supply was down at the bottom, and that's where it was feeding the air from, and you had a longer opportunity for breathing. It was genius. And he, in fact, in 1912, won first place at the New York Safety Exposition in New York. Unfortunately, even though he won, he was not able to accept his own award because, the way that it was back then was that African Americans were not welcomed. And so he took someone with him, and the other guy pretended he was Garrett Morgan, and my grandfather pretended that he was Big Chief Mason from an unknown Native American tribe in Canada, hoping that no one would be able to figure it out, and demonstrated. They literally set up a tent like a teepee, and he would put on this gas, mask, and go into the tent and stay there for a few minutes, and then come out and be fine. And it was enough to win the first prize at the New York Safety Expo. And business took off from there. Next slide, Eliza. So, he was doing quite well. Again, he was doing what any good entrepreneur would do. He was building his businesses and building equity. They tell you that you should have 5 streams of income, if you really want to build wealth and build income. Stream number 2. All right, hair number 1. Well, clothing really, but that one was by now small. That was, my grandmother's thing. The hair care, the safety hood. 1916, this safety hood was once again put to the test. In Cleveland, they were building what is now called the Garrett Morgan westerly water filtration plant. By 1915 or 16, the city was starting to grow very rapidly, and water along the lake was becoming polluted quite heavily. And they were using it for drinking water, which they could not do because of all the industrial push and everything else. So they had to build a water filtration plant and go out literally 5 miles into the lake, right, in order to pull clean water. So these men, primarily Irishmen, they called them disparagingly sandhogs, but they were new immigrants, and they were disposable. They paid them $1 a day for this extremely dangerous work. And they went out 5 miles out on the lake, underneath the lake, to build these tunnels. Well, they got under there one night in July, and they hit a gas ball or a gas bubble, and it exploded, and they were trapped. And the men on shore could not get to them. They sent out a rescue party. They went down this shaft, and I've been in this shaft. It is scary. They went down this shaft, and as soon as the door opened and the fumes, they inhaled the fumes, they fell to the floor. In fact, there's a book that's written by a local Cleveland writer. It's called "They Died Crawling," that talks about this experience. At any rate, these men didn't come back, didn't respond, and so now they're really frantic. What are we going to do? Well, someone remembers Garrett Morgan has this safety hood. Let's call him and see if he can come and do something. All right, so they call him, and he and his brother Frank, the other son, they are in their pajamas because it's like 3 o'clock in the morning now. They literally jump with their pajamas on, grab a bunch of safety hoods, get in their car, and race down to the edge of the lake. When they get down there, everyone says, you have to go down there first, right? We want you to go first, you and your brother, and see what you can do. And P.S., you cannot wear your shoes because there are live wires down there, and if you're wearing your shoes, you may step on those wires and become electrocuted. So you're going to have to go down in bare feet and feel your way around down there. Okay, well, my grandfather and his brother accepted the challenge. They went down. My grandfather describes the scene as being gruesome, of course. It's smoky, it's terrible, it's, fumes everywhere, and all the same, they persisted. They saw many dead bodies, and so they grabbed one of those big carts. They started loading bodies first into the cart, and then those men who were alive, right, some of the men who were alive, they put them on top of the dead bodies, rolled it back into the shaft, and came upstairs, or came up the shaft. They were met with cheers, of course. Then other men grabbed safety hoods, put them on, they went down, and the rescue continued. All in all, there were 80 men down in the shaft. Most of them died, but I think that there were 11 or 12 who survived. Not great odds, but at least bodies were recovered, and these people didn't live, they weren't buried down in the mine shaft. Their families had an opportunity to bury them and to grieve for them. This is a picture from the Cleveland Press that shows the mayhem that was going on. And in the very center is my grandfather. The picture's from 1916, so it doesn't translate very well, by today's standards, but I think that it's very clear to see him with the safety hood slung over his back, helping to pull someone out. And if you can see the real photo here, the man is bloodied, and it's a terrible scene. My grandfather says that he had nightmares for his entire life, flashbacks to these moments. When everyone was up and everything was all settled, there were lots of accolades for everyone except Garrett Morgan. In fact, they said, was he really even there? I mean, the mayor of Cleveland said, well, I don't know if he was there or not, even though he's in the pictures, in all the pictures, okay? And that was, that was an embittering moment for him, I'm sure, but he didn't let it get him down. I will say that the Carnegie Foundation, which continues to amaze me, 105 years after the fact, are still defending themselves because they didn't give him a medal in support of what he did, although they gave medals to everyone else who went down the mine shaft. And their rationale, their explanation for this published is that he was wearing a gas mask that he knew would work, so he really didn't endanger his own life because he knew that his gas mask would work, and therefore he was not in danger. There you have it. It's okay. Eliza, next slide, please. This is just a refined version of this gas mask. He actually sold the gas mask all around the country to fire departments and police departments and, other safety organizations who used it. Over the course of time, it was refined naturally, and he gave the patent to the U.S. government because he felt that it was important during World War I and beyond, and at a time when the world was being menaced by Germans and mustard gases and that sort of thing, that it was more important to give the patent to the government. And he had done very well with this patent and with this product and was pleased and happy to do so. Next, Eliza. Okay, so this is just, I think, my last picture on this. There was a commemoration of the centennial of the Crib disaster, and that is, it's a kind of dark picture, but of me accepting an award, and in the backdrop is the Westerly, the Garrett A. Morgan Westerly water filtration plant, which my husband as a youth, for a summer job, worked there, digging holes or doing something. I don't know what he was doing there, but amazingly, he was able to work there and contribute to our legacy, which is marvelous. It was the first time that members of all of the families, or the surviving families, had a chance to get together. The first time in 100 years. We had never seen each other before or had any contact, and this event was the first time. And I will say that it was an emotional moment for me, and it was really gratifying to hear descendants like myself say to us how grateful they were to our grandfather for not only his invention, but for his willingness to go down into the shaft and bring their family members up. Liza? All right, so again, by now Garrett Morgan is feeling fine, right? He's making money on his hair products, he's making money on his safety hoods. Things are okay. But this is what traffic looked like around 1920. Garrett Morgan had a car. He always loved to have a cool car, right? Really fancy, neat cars. And, they, I'm sure, got dented and knocked up quite a lot because traffic in the early 1920s, in Northeast Ohio anyway, was crazy. There were some traffic like signals on the streets. Many of them were just stop and go, all right? But there were all kinds of vehicles on the street. There were pedestrians, horse-drawn carts, trucks and lorries, automobiles, trolleys, you name it, with not a whole lot of what we now call intelligent transportation systems. And so, again, I think this may be a little dramatic, this picture, but I think it perfectly illustrates what traffic was like. My grandfather was driving in his cool car with his children, and he saw an accident, a really terrible accident, that involved an automobile and a horse-drawn cart that had a little girl on it. The little girl was thrown from the cart, terribly injured. The horse was also terribly injured, had to be put down in front of his at that time, two sons, my Uncle John and my dad. And my dad says that he had nightmares, from that experience, it was traumatic, for a young child to see something like that. At any rate, my grandfather said, okay, once again, I'm going to put my thinking cap on and figure out what it is that I can do about this situation. And voila, I think, Eliza, the next slide, is the Garrett Morgan traffic signal. Now, the Garrett Morgan traffic signal it doesn't look like the modern red, yellow, and green that we see right now, but this traffic signal was revolutionary, and I'm going to tell you why. He received the patent in 1923, November 20th, 1923. It's seared in my mind because we're working on activities now to celebrate the centennial of his traffic signal and why it was so important. So what my grandfather did was, there were signals, again, that were stop and go, but it didn't address the intersection. Most accidents, even today, happen within the intersection. Am I right? So, if you are, number one, if you're going and someone flips to stop, it's very difficult to just stop on a dime. And if you're going or if you're stopped and then they say go, and cars are still moving, you're hesitant, you could get hit from behind, a number of things could happen. At that time, if you're on a horse-drawn cart, horses can't read now, can they? What do they know? So, and some people couldn't either, by the way. So, even though it says stop and it says go, what he did was invent a mechanism that moved the arms in a way that it meant all exit the intersection, right? Nobody enter the intersection. If you're not in the intersection, stop, which is now the yellow light. And if you are in the intersection, get out, right? Keep moving. So that was the all clear. Now, even more than that, I read I'm ashamed to say I read the patent from cover to cover for the first time in preparation for this conversation. And in their remarks about the patent, what they say is that even more than the yellow light and the warning, it was having all of the arms up and having everyone stop just for those few seconds. And if you notice on a traffic signal, there's a time when all lights are red. Everyone is stopped. And that gives you, it's just that pause that's long enough to clear the intersection. Any wayward people that may come flying through, get through the intersection. It is that pause that got him the patent, and it's that pause that has never changed. In all of the changes of the traffic signals that we have seen, new technology, they monitor everything with traffic signals now, but that one thing that has not changed, that has endured, is that pause. And that's how he received his patent. So he received the patent in 1923, but realized that it was not something that he was going to be able to manufacture, although he advertises that this can be manufactured very inexpensively. Well, General Electric said, okay, they bought it. They bought the patent from my grandfather at the time for $40,000. Now, 1923, well, we think $40,000, that's nothing, right? Okay, but in 1923, that was a bunch of money. It was, over $500,000. In fact, in today's dollars, $660,000. And he had some other bells and whistles that added to that made it quite lucrative for him to sell that patent. Selling that patent allowed him then in 1923, by that time he was in his 40s, that allowed him to purchase about 400 acres of land outside of Oberlin, Ohio. He already had a house, and his children were, youngish adults and that sort of thing, and so he was okay there. But it allowed him really to, in my opinion, retire. Right then, he was able to think about Garrett Morgan, the civic-minded man. He didn't have to worry about money anymore. He knew that he had several streams of income, and he could take his place as a civic leader in the Black community in Northeast Ohio. So again, my grandfather had his hair products. He had various things going on. He wanted to advertise in the newspapers because he got tired of driving. He had a big bus that he had kitted out, with his name and everything on the side, and he had a calliope on the inside. And, my Uncle John's, the bane of his existence was getting up on Saturday mornings when my grandfather would say, "Oh, let's go out on the bus," and my uncle would play the calliope on the back of the bus, to draw attention to business, or if they went to Pittsburgh or somewhere. My uncle hated it. He just thought, no self-respecting, good-looking young man is doing this. And so, my grandfather also got tired of it, I think. He wanted to just advertise like everyone else, mainstream. But the Cleveland Plain Dealer and the Cleveland Press would not accept his advertisements. "Thank you very much, Mr. Morgan, but we're sorry, we cannot accept your advertisements. We don't take advertisements from colored people." Okay. So my grandfather said, "Fine. You know what? I'm tired of the newspaper only covering negative stories about our community, and we need someplace to advertise." Hence the Cleveland Call. He established the Cleveland Call roughly 1920, and he merged then very quickly with another paper, the Post. They became the Call and Post. All right. It was the African American newspaper of Northeast Ohio. It's still in existence, and it is the oldest and the largest African American paper in the state of Ohio. It is distributed in Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. You see here a picture of the little boys, the little paper boys that used to deliver the Call and Post all over town. And very quickly, my grandfather found his third or maybe fourth income stream, right? Because advertisement was brisk. And not only was he able to advertise his products, other African American businesses advertised theirs as well. And guess who else? Mainstream companies advertised there too. Why? Because they recognized that African Americans also spent money. They bought groceries and dry cleaning and whatever else, right? Which gave the Cleveland Press and the Cleveland Plain Dealer pause. All of a sudden, "Well, Mr. Morgan, you know what, we've rethought our policy and we're happy to accept your advertisements after all." Well, he said, "Fine, that's great. I'm more than happy to advertise in your newspapers because it will only widen my scope," which he did. I mean, he didn't hold a grudge over that. Just thought, fine, there's plenty of room for everybody, right? There's room for everyone on the good list. So let's do this. But the Call and Post newspaper was, and still is, the beacon of news for the African American community. It shares the highs and the lows, new businesses and everything in between. And I myself was the Christmas baby for at least 3 or 4 years in the Cleveland Call and Post. Next slide. So this is a picture of my grandfather as an older man. As I'm sure you know, as he aged, he went blind. He had glaucoma. He did continue to innovate and invent, however, and he just led a very good and peaceful life, I'll say. He ran for city council in 1931, again, because he didn't feel that there was a voice, an African American voice, being heard in Northeast Ohio, in Cleveland in particular. People were paying taxes, but they had no voice in council and in the mayor's office. And so he ran for city council, and although he did not win, it became evident that there was definitely a voting bloc and interested citizens in the African American community, and they gained power. They gained political power. And I'm very proud of my grandfather for that. I mean, 1931, it's not easy to run for office or to do anything for that matter. But he was a very strong and determined man. And he used to say, I will go around something, I will go over it, or I will go through it. Either way, I'm going. And he did. Next slide, please. All right, so I'd like to thank you. This is the end of my brief conversation. Again, you see the blueprint of the traffic signal. I've shown you a few of his patents and blueprints. I'd like to once again thank the Trust for having me here. I'm delighted to have spoken to you all. I hope that I shared some insights into Garrett Morgan, native son, with you. And I am looking forward to answering all of your questions. Thank you.